Hello and welcome back to this downville idealistic crusade. Today I'm talking about Book 8 of the series, the classic The Mystery of Cabin Island. This, as I've said before in other videos, is the most special book in the series for me because it was the first I ever read, talking about the revised text when I was growing up in the early 1990s, and it's really one of the key books that founded my love of literature, not just series literature, not just the Hardy Boys series, but literature in general. So this book holds a very special place for me, not just within the Hardy Boys canon, but for reading in general. Without this book, it's much more unlikely that I would have become such an avid reader at such an early age. So this is really one of the books I have the most nostalgia for. It's one of the books I've read the most times in my life and is the most special of the whole canon for me because it was what introduced me to the whole world of the Hardy Boys and series literature. It's also the perfect book for the holidays because it takes place at the holiday season and has so much of a wintry backdrop and the perfect setting for a winter story, particularly around the holidays, that it's very much cemented itself as pretty much the Christmas winter season end of the year book to read for fans of the series. So I know there are people who actually reread this book every single year around Christmas time. So it sort of becomes traditional in that way as well, and it is a perfect book for that. Another reason why it's perfect for that is that this is an example of the revised text not really changing the original text. This is a book where both texts are outstanding and classics of both their respective parts of the canon, and the revised text merely adds a subplot and makes a few minor changes in addition to cutting down the page count. So going from the revised text that I know like the back of my hand into the original text, I wasn't, encountering all kinds of things that were completely different as you do in some of the original text. So this is a perfect example of how one of the revised texts can streamline a already perfect original text and add a new bit of business with a subplot in order to strengthen the action a little bit and give the boys a bit more something to do in terms of the actual story plotting. The text this time around, of course, the original text was written and published in 1929, written by series creator Leslie McFarlane, and does have the significantly longer page count that all the original texts do. The revised text was done in 1966 by Andrew Svensson, who did a number of the text revisions in addition to other Hardy tales, and it has the quicker pace and tighter plotting that is common to the entire revision process for all the revised texts. To talk about the plot a little bit, it's seemingly a bit more straightforward starting out than most of the books. So some may find it a bit simplistic at the onset, but this is a book where it's not about how convoluted the mystery is. It's much more about the overall experience, and the experience is so vivid that it befits the mystery not being super convoluted. And again, see, it's all set on pretty much in one location on Cabin Island itself. The boys are rather isolated, so it does have the aspects of being a sort of camping adventure story because they are, for the most part of the book, in that one central location. But in both versions of the text of Cabin Island, the Hardy Boys encounter and befriend Elroy Jefferson, who owns the titular Cabin Island, where he and his family used to stay, in the cabin that they built there, and essentially offers the boys the use of the cabin over the holidays. So they go there with their best pals, Chet and Wharton and Biff Hooper, who are mainstays in the entire canon. And of course, there's a mystery there because it's the Hardy Boys. They keep encountering this strange man named Handley who wants them completely to be off said island, and for apparent reasons of his own, and is the villain of the piece. And meanwhile, the boys are also essentially mocked and chastised and screwed around with by local bullies. But the whole winter background really adds such an atmosphere of the story to the story. In addition to the boys being at this cabin and sort of roughing it and enjoying the idea of being able to camp out at a cabin over the holidays with their best friends and not have their parents around and things. So reading this as a kid, you can sort of get in on the action in that way and imagine the sort of fun of doing that while also having the mystery aspect text to sort of spice things up. And over the course of the story, there is essentially it becomes a partial lost treasure story, because Elroy Jefferson had a robbery a number of years before, and depending on which version of the text you're reading, the actual item is different. In the original text, his extremely valuable stamp collection was stolen. In the revised text, it's a collection of extremely valuable antique medals. That's just one of the revised text changes, but the actual point of it in the story is the same. So there you get that nice treasure background of having a treasure hunt, and it becomes quickly obvious why this Hanley character is skulking around the island and being all malevolent for, at first, seemingly no apparent reason. But in the revised text, you also get the addition of a subplot, as is common in a lot of revised texts where they're just reworking the original plot. In the revised text, Elroy Jefferson has a lost grandson, Johnny Jefferson, who the boys are sort of also tasked with, hey, if you could find my missing grandson, that would be great too. So that's the subplot of the revised text, and the boys are also very quickly cognizant of the fact that there may be other people skulking around the island as well, in addition to Hanley and the two boys at Bayport they can't stand. So the revised text does actually have quite a bit more in terms of business in the story going on. So it is a bit more convoluted. You have an entire edition of a new subplot, and there's the much quicker pace as common to all the revised text. There's also some really wonderful, very wintry sequences. There is a heavy snowstorm or two, of course. They do have to really rough it out in the cabin, and of course their supplies get stolen and all the fun stuff of camping and winter stories. But there's also great winter activity scenes. There's a lot of sequences in ice boats on the frozen lake, which is a real fascinating visual to read in a book and sort of picture in your mind's eye, because it's not very common to read stories with ice boating in them. And I know this was my introduction to the whole concept when I was growing up of what an ice boat was and how they worked, and sort of envisioning that. Again, they're really striking sequences, and there are some bits of danger, and of course an ice boat crash and things, but it's a nice background that's very specific to Cabin Island in particular. So that's one of the signifiers I think most people would think of right off the bat when you bring up Cabin Island. Again, both texts are excellent, and this is a great example of a revised text adding to the plot of the original text without changing anything, and adding the usual tighter plotting because of the shorter page count of the revised text. So this doesn't detract or remove anything from the original text. It merely adds to it and tightens the pace and sort of builds on what the original text did before. And it is my favorite of the entire series because it was the first one I ever read and the one I have the greatest nostalgia for. So, jumping over to the original text, which a lot of people feel the same way about, I feel like a broken record on these, but it's very obvious from page one when you read one of the Leslie McFarlane written books. The difference in tone and world building and character building is pretty massive. So while you don't have the subplot of the revised text, and it's not as the plot itself is not as, it's really not as complicated. It's a bit more straightforward because you don't have the whole extra subplot, and there are some extra characters in the revised text and things. The original text is much more straightforward, but with the addition, of course, of the extra page count and McFarlane's beautiful prose style, the sense of immersion is much greater, I think. And this is coming from somebody who grew up with the revised text and has read it perhaps more times than any other book I've ever read in my life. And the revised text is my favorite Hardy Boys book, period. Will always be my favorite Hardy Boys book. But the original text is a better written book. But of course, it's not exactly a fair comparison because the revised text all had the constraints of what the Stratemeyer Syndicate wanted, and it wasn't like Leslie McFarlane in the 1920s being able to just literally sit down and write a book of a certain length, and with the basic idea of it's going to be another series volume. The revised text had so many more constraints on them, plus they added a whole subplot in this example, and so that dictated where the story was going to have to go. But the original text, it's much more lived in. It's much more vivid in the reader's imagination in terms of every little event that's also replicated in the revised text is much more detailed. It takes a bit more time, so it feels a bit more realistic in terms of you can really feel the passage of time a lot more. And this is, again, something I've said about every single one of the Leslie McFarlane books so far. I think anyone coming to these, whether you're a fan of the series or not, if you read one of these books back to back with the text revision, I think that would be apparent to most anyone. And it's not something that all fans agree on. Some people do prefer the tighter plotting and the additional subplots and the aspects of the revision process that set the revised text apart from the original text, and that's perfectly fine. Totally understandable. But even for me, growing up with the revised text, when you get to one of the McFarlane original texts, particularly this early in the series, there is a significant difference. So this being my favorite of the books when I came to the original text, it was a big eye opener, even though the actual story is the same. I'd also say that once again the danger element is a bit ramped up when the big sequences happen where the boys are placed in potential mortal peril. It's a bit more gritty in the original text, as are all of them. So that's another aspect of the revised text where they definitely tried to tone down the mortal peril a little bit. So in the original text, during the snowstorm and various things, you definitely you fear for the boys' lives a bit more than you do in the revised text, because the level of danger is not quite as stressed in the revised text as it is in the original text. So aside from the usual things I say about the differences between the two texts, the real changes here are the revised text adding the subplot about the missing grandson, adding one or two other characters, and of course changing the actual lost item from the stamp collection to the medal collection. So mostly minor changes. The real big difference is, of course, the addition of the whole additional new subplot, but it's actually nicely layered in. It's not like, oh, we just go off on a tangent and now we're doing a completely different plot for a while of the book. It's actually woven in to the original plot quite well at various points, and so it's not like it detracts from the original story. I think it's one of the best examples of the revised text adding a subplot to the original text story, but keeping everything else pretty much the same. So in terms of the books themselves, it's not exactly a fair comparison as with all of these, because they were done with different mindsets and almost 40 years apart. So of course they're going to have differences. But I do think both are exceptionally strong classics of both the original text and the revised text. I think which you may prefer will be up to you, because they're both very good, and there's nothing wrong with either of them. And they're just they show the respective strengths of the original text McFarlane wrote, and then the strengths of the revised text in terms of what the Stratemeyer Syndicate dictated. So they're both absolute classics of the series. They are. Most fans will agree on, if this isn't their favorite book in the series, whichever text you're talking about, it's right up there. It's one of everyone's top favorites, pretty much. Again, it's my favorite simply because of nostalgia, and it was the first book I ever read in the series, and it's the most near and dear to me. And I do still think it is one of the strongest books in the series. So if I actually did try and do a ranking, it probably would be number one, or at least right up there in the top 2 or 3. It is an absolute classic, even if the mystery isn't as convoluted as some of the later books would get, or as the stakes don't seem as dramatic on the surface. But this isn't that type of adventure mystery story. This is much more. Of course, it's contained almost entirely on Cabin Island, but you also get the warmth of the holiday spirit. There's a Christmas morning sequence. There's the wonderful winter background. There's the right notes of danger and mystery, and again, there's a treasure hunt involved. So it's got all the right aspects of mystery and adventure and outdoorsmanship, and you have the camping aspects and the winter aspects. So there's something for everyone in Cabin Island. That's why it's really been a classic of the series, I think, ever since it was first published in 1929. So, and if I had to choose which book I thought was better, my personal preference would be for the original text, edging it out a little bit, because I really think McFarlane's writing is so wonderful, and it really sticks in the reader's mind, and it really immerses you in the story it's building as it's being told. So pretty much when you're reading one of these, time stops and you're able to just immerse yourself in the story that's going on. The revised text does that as well, but it's a different sort of feeling. So it's hard for me, because the revised text I know like the back of my hand. Going into the original text, you can see the foundation is the same, the bones of the story are the same, but it's an eye-opening experience going to the different sort of pace and not having the subplot and everything. So it's really more about the writing styles, and McFarlane being able to not have the extra constraints of the revision process. But I love both of them. So I really couldn't choose one or the other. But if I had to, the original text does have the benefit of McFarlane's great writing, and the more leisurely pace and greater sense of danger allows the immersion factor, I think, to be a bit greater. But not everyone will share that opinion. This is just merely a very loose comparison of the two texts, and I will be rereading these back to back every time I read the series now. I think this is the perfect way to do it, is to read the text back to back, and to really get the full story experience of what is still my favorite in the entire canon, The Mystery of Cabin Island. So now to talk about the various covers of the book. Here we only have 4 to talk about, and they're all relatively the same. At least the first 3 are very much variations on a theme. So once again, we have the first cover, which was done by W.S. Rogers for the original 1929 edition. And this is in his usual wonderful style that's it seems very simplistic at first. We have a nice natural scene from the book showing the beautiful natural beauty of Cabin Island. We see the snowy cabin, but we have the elements of mystery, because this is where the boys are observing the villainous Hanley come up to the door of the cabin, because he's skulking around because he's wanting to search the cabin once again with nefarious intentions. And this is really the standout moment of the book, when the boys are going to confront him. And it has all the right notes of the beauty of nature, the wonderful wintertime setting, and the danger note and the actual mystery being all of these being contained in a nice single image. So as usual, it may seem a bit simplistic on the surface, and it has the wonderful painting quality of all of the covers that he did. But when you look at it more closely, you start getting the greater notes that the image is conveying. And of course, it's always perfect when you actually have an event from the book being depicted as the cover image. So that's something you, of course, always want to do, and you want to sell the book on the excitement factor and all the various elements that will make it most exciting to young boys. So again, this sets the sort of tone for the next 2 covers of this book, which are again variations on a theme. So the one thing I will say about the Rogers cover is the composition of where the boys are. It's a bit not awkward, but the way the cabin is laid out, it looks very naturalistic, but the actual composition seems a little off in terms of where the boys are positioned and how they're sort of smaller in the frame. So this is something I think that on the revision of this cover, they really tried to focus on in terms of making the composition a bit more dramatic, at least. So then we move on to that 1944 A.O. Scott cover done for the Yellow Spine era. And this is, of course, the same moment, but with the much more dramatic composition of the boys much closer to Henley in the cabin, and they're sort of peeking around the snowy tree. And it has much more of a sense of contained action in it, and the suspense is greater simply due to the tighter composition. Everything else is pretty much the same. We have the snowy cabin, we have the wintry backdrop, we have the mystery and danger elements, but those have been significantly increased upon. So I do think this is a dramatic improvement simply for the composition alone. Also, there's a wonderful use of color. And of course, being from the 40s, the boys' attire is a bit more updated because the original cover, they obviously look like they're in the 1920s because it's when the book was written. But the one thing here, as I say, with all the Scott covers, while a lot of them have really much improved composition like this, you do get a little bit of the sense of the sort of, for lack of a better term, the cartoony feel to the just the overall effect of the imagery. This one has a lot less of that than his others, I think. But this one, as usual, I think, is extraordinarily overshadowed by what came next. So this one, I've always felt is sort of like a rough draft or a demo of the next cover, which was commissioned to basically replicate this cover design with a much more photorealistic style, which of course is the iconic Rudy Nappy cover, which was done for the 1960 release and the end of the Dust Jacket era, and then has lasted on all the picture cover releases up until the last few years and the final cover art. So this, for me, is the image I think of for Cabin Island, because Cabin Island is the first book I ever read. This is one of the first images that pop up in my head when I even hear the Hardy Boys. It has the Rudy Nappy, much more photorealistic look to it. The fine detail is significantly greater. It is the same image composition, obviously. So this is very much a revision of the Scott cover, but if you look closely, it's also slightly changed in the actual layout. The tree is a much bigger tree. If you also look, the way that everything is in much greater detail, it allows you to get the expressions on the faces across a lot more. And it also, for me, I think it actually adds to the suspense factor, because in the Scott cover, it looks like the boys are being spotted by Hanley. This one, it looks like they're about to be spotted. So I think the suspense factor is actually increased here. And it has the island look a bit more desolate in terms of the sky is kind of overcast, whereas in the Scott cover, it's much brighter. So I think the atmosphere is actually much greater here, and I think this is the definitive Cabin Island cover. It's the one, of course, that is burned into my brain so vividly, but this, of course, stayed in print the longest, and of course lasted until 2017 when we got the new Penguin update as part of their Black Spine series, where they did the first 9 or so books and then sort of gave up. This is another by Ryan Brinkerhoff in the sort of new design aesthetic with the new logo and the sort of very comic strip cartoony vibe for the series. This is doing like some of the books in this iteration, like The Missing Chums, where it's sort of, again, a comic strip representation where you have panels almost representing different events from the book. So we finally have the ice boats on the cover at the very top, but it's very small. And we have the cabin with the footprints, and then we have the boys in front of the chimney. So at least we're getting actual events from the book and its actual actions going on. But the color is actually quite subdued, and the logo is so big, it really obscures the top image, and the images are just sort of like... The actual dimensions are a bit weird because they're not actual square panels. So it's okay, I suppose, but I'm just not exactly sure what the whole aesthetic behind or what the idea behind the design aesthetic on these were. And not all of them do this. So this is one of these where it not only has the very comic looking style to the artwork, but this one actually goes for a sort of comic panel effect of events from the book. So I do think it is easily the weakest of the 4 covers, and I think was entirely unnecessary because the Rudy Nappy cover is, I think, definitive and has been in print for all these decades. So, I'm glad they at least tried to do something new with reprinting the books to attract new audiences, but I don't really think it was necessary to do new artwork. I think they could do some different things in terms of marketing and just, have the books as is with the older artwork, or at least have something that was a bit more akin to the classic artwork. So it's okay. It's not the worst thing in the world, but I'm just not a fan of it at all. Now let's talk about the books in my collection. I have a number of different editions behind me. Of course, I can't resist Cabin Island since it's my favorite book. So to talk about my oldest copy, this is, of course, a dust jacketless brown copy. It's not a tweed copy because it has this sort of I never know how to describe these, but this is an older copy. It's not quite a wartime edition, but it seems to be from just after that point, so it doesn't have the heavily browned, very pulpy paper that is common to the wartime editions, but due to the actual cover material used, the sort of darker, dingier brown, and also the fact that the book list at the end only lists to shortwave mystery, seems to indicate this might be just slightly after the war, so probably about 1945 era, I would possibly guess. But otherwise, it is the original text. It has the orange Greta end papers, and it also has the revised, simplified, printed opening artwork. This is, of course, of the ice boat crash. And we have the original text in its original font setting and everything. So, like the revised texts all having their own particular font style and layout, all the original texts have their own as well. So, if you know the difference between the two, if you pick up a copy of one of the books and you just open it, it becomes pretty obvious if you've got an original or revised text just by the text block alone. Here is my lovely copy of the second jacket art in the Yellow Spine era. This, again, has it's a really nice condition dust jacket for the cover artwork. Here's the Yellow Spine, and then advertising Bomba the Jungle Boy on the back. The interior lists to Yellow Feather Mystery, which would put this at about a 1953 copy. I have the orange Greta end papers, of course. And then the actual book itself is, of course, a legitimate tweed copy in terms of it actually has the iconic brown tweed actual boards. Everything else, of course, is the same as the copy I just showed you, but of course in much nicer condition. So we have the simplified opening art printed in ink and the same text block, except the title has been removed. So that's something you'll notice if you get a bunch of different copies of original text of the same book. Sometimes they'll have the actual title printed on the chapter 1 opening page, and then other times like this, it's not there. So that's something that seems to vary depending on the printing you have. This is my picture cover copy of the original text with the Rudy Nappy artwork. Looks wonderful on here in terms of the print quality. This is in pretty good shape, a little bit of wear, but definitely much better condition-wise than what you find most original text picture cover prints. This lists to Aztec Warrior, which dates it at about 1964, so this is one of the last copies to feature the original text. So this is one of those books where if you see a picture cover copy, you just want to open it and flip through if you're looking for an original text edition because they are out there like this. So you look at the outside, a lot of these older picture cover copies, the spines are a bit more rigid, and the actual print quality is just, it feels a little bit different. So if you see a bunch of these on the shelf, you can usually pick out the older ones from the ones from, say, the 1970s or 80s. Of course, another giveaway is this has the brown and white end papers, which would change over pretty quickly after this point to the black and white ones. There's the updated listing of the other titles. We have the second ink version of the front artwork from the previous two editions, and there is the opening page once again. But of course, everything is in the picture cover, so the binding is actually a little bit tighter, and you have the actual picture cover on the outside you're reading instead of the tweed with the dust jacket. So here is my beloved childhood copy. This is a 1995 printing in the flashlight era of the revised text. So this is the version I've read the most. This is the first Hardy Boys book I ever got. This is the one I read to death. It has a little bit of wear, but thankfully, kid me realized very quickly to try and keep my books as nice as possible in terms of condition as I could. But this, as with most of the flashlight books, you can tell when they're well loved and have been read a lot when they open very easily, because usually the flashlights have the very stiff binding that the first couple times you read it, it has a lot of cracking, and you have to really force it open a little bit. But the older editions like this, in terms of the printings from the 90s and early 2000s, are much sturdier and seem to be better done than the ones from the later 2000s. This has the revised text artwork, which is of course different, and the completely different revised text block. There's also, as all the revised texts have, the internal illustrations throughout. Cabin Island has a few that are even the double page spreads like this. Of course, here's another of the iconic revised text illustrations. Of course, these are revised text exclusive. You don't get any other internal illustrations in the original text. And then, of course, here is the rear. I also picked up this 1999 printing when I was growing up, because they used to sell the books in bundles, so you could get a larger pack of books. So you get a 3 to 5 at a time. So I wound up getting a few duplicates. So this is a 1999 flashlight printing. And then here is my 1995 copy. And as you can see right off the bat, the actual color depth is different. This has much more red in the image. The actual color of the front art will vary wildly throughout all of the picture cover and flashlight books especially. So you'll notice that if you had 10 copies of the same book side to side from any of the picture covers and any of the flashlights, they're all going to look a little bit different in terms of the color, the actual fine detail, the focus, the sharpness, and of course the cropping, which is the most extreme on the flashlights, because a significant part of the sides and the top are gone. So here you can tell the cropping is different, as is the color. The actual the later printing is also much more is a bit contrastier. It's a bit hazier, which is something you'll find with a lot of these, and it sort of has almost a slight greenish cast to the background. So it's just these things you start to notice when you're a kid and you just look at these for way too long. You'll notice that you can start to find printing variations, and that's just something you'll see across the books, pretty much from the picture covers onward especially. There are, of course, variations from before that, but in terms of the actual artwork presentation, you'll note that especially even in the flashlight. Other than that, they are, of course, ostensibly the same, but they are before, thankfully. It's really the mid to late 2000s, the last flashlight editions they would do. If you get a copy from 2006 onward, if you look at the actual copyright date, the printing date on any of the flashlights you may find, you'll notice that the artwork getting really sloppy and various other goofs and things really pop up there. Anything from the 90s up to about 2005, but particularly about 95 to 2002 or so in terms of the printings on the flashlights. I think they're just better done. They feel sturdier. I think the binding's even a little bit better, and the artwork is usually better represented. So it's usually the later books where you find more screw-ups in the cover art not looking very good, or being cropped too heavily, or things like that. So this is just another example I had of an older 90s printing of a flashlight edition. And then here is the modern 2017 edition. So this is from Penguin as part of their relaunch of the early books. They all have the matching black spine, which is still feels weird to see a black spine instead of a blue one. And the art has a nice wraparound effect, continuing the sort of comic book panel or comic strip panel idea they were going for, which you can see how sort of odd it looks to have the all the boxes be a little stilted, and they've once again mixed the sort of red and green. So it's okay, but I think it is definitely the least attention grabbing of all the covers, even though it technically has the most going on. Once again, it has the nice sort of glossy hardbound feel, so it's pretty much just the flashlight edition, but with slightly different dimensions and the new cover artwork. Also, the binding feels a little different. So honestly, while you may think at first this is just a flashlight edition with a different cover, it doesn't feel as solidly printed as the flashlight edition. So I wouldn't actually recommend getting any of these unless you're a nerdy completionist like I am, or if that's just the edition you find around and it's the cheapest one. I mean, they're okay, but I don't think anything on these was an improvement over the flashlight editions, to be honest. Everything else is the same, except for we have the new title logo on the title page, which just feels weird, and honestly, it doesn't look very good. So yeah, I wish they had just kept everything as is. And then the updated copyright page with the penguin logo. So again, they only did the up to. Actually, really, I think it was just up to Cabin Island. I don't even think they did Great Airport Mystery. I could be wrong, but they haven't done any more since this point. So I guess they just decided to just keep going with the flashlights, which honestly is the best choice because these are not really an improvement at all. So those are my thoughts on The Mystery of Cabin Island, Book 8 of the iconic Hardy Boys original canon. It is one of the most beloved books in the series, whether you're talking about the original or revised text. It really is a holiday tradition for many fans of the series, young and old. I know I myself like to read this book around the holiday season as well. I think if you read this as pretty early as a child, it becomes a standout favorite for many different reasons, and chiefly also because it is the most holiday themed and oriented of the books. There are some others that you can read around the holidays, like Yellow Feather Mystery, and they're great holiday reads. But this I think is the one that seems the most iconic, the one that really screams, Christmas, holiday season, winter time. And I think both texts are outstanding. Both texts are absolute classics. This is one of the iconic classic children's books, I'd argue. It's one of the most iconic and beloved of the entire series, and with good reason. And once you start reading it, I think that becomes very obvious very quickly. So whether you prefer the original text style or the revision text style, you can't really lose with either one. And I think this is another great way to compare the revision process, and by reading both texts, and you can see what the revised text adds and then what also it loses from the original text style of Leslie McFarlane. So I think this is another great example where you can read the two books and get the perfect encapsulation of the benefits and strengths of each text example, because both are excellent and perfect representations of what the two different text styles are best at. So it's still obviously my favorite book in the series. It's the one I have the greatest affection for. It's the one that's been with me the longest. And again, without The Mystery of Cabin Island, I don't know if I would have ever become as avid a reader as I still am today. So I have a lot to thank this book for, and of course the fact that I have books everywhere. Well, maybe. This book really started something. So this is one of those, if you want to introduce kids to reading, and of course the Hardy Boys, this would be a great book to start with if you didn't decide to go in chronological numbered order. This book really has a bit of everything, and it's an iconic classic of the series, and it is beloved by fans for absolutely good reason. So I hope this has been at least somewhat fun and informative to hear me babble on once again about the classic Hardy Boys series and my undying love of them. I wanted to do Cabin Island around the holidays, so I felt this was the perfect time. So it's really, You can read this book at other times of the year, but it feels weird to be reading it or talking about Mystery of Cabin Island and it not be Christmas time, New Year's, end of the year, where it's the middle of winter and it's around the holidays. It really goes hand in hand with the holiday season. So I wanted to try and time it up where I was at least talking about Cabin Island sometime around the holidays. So for fans of this book, I would love to hear your thoughts on the two different text editions and which you may prefer. Again, both are so great that you can really go either way. There's no losing out with either text. It's just going to be a matter of personal preference or what you're used to, I think. And I adore both of them. But of course, the revised text is the one that's the most special to me. But the original text is absolutely stellar. So you can't lose with either one, and I think it's essential to have both because they're both classics of their respective text edition series. So do stay tuned for my next video in the Hardy Boys rereading process. So I will be back hopefully pretty soon with my video on Book 9, The Great Airport Mystery. And until then, keep enjoying reading and collecting the classic Hardy Boys series and spreading the love of the series wherever you can. And if you haven't read it in a while, or if you haven't read it this holiday season, take another trip back and enjoy your time at Cabin Island. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.